By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Denis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar-Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar-Daban mountain range. The Hamar-Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar-Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar-Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar-Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break, and in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down in the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule, and it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood. And she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting, and they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks, and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood, walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old, her name was Valentina Yudachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar-Deban Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth. And then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart. And then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. She's heaving like something's going on inside of her, and then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha. And she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics. And Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her. And he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head. And she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids, and then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers, who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability, decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain all the way down to the forest And once they got down there, two of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches, and so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all, and they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? The next and final story of today's episode is a MrBallen fan favorite. It's called Bell's Canyon. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down, and periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent, and this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm gonna look out and I'm gonna see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm gonna see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire, there's no flashlight, there is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's gonna pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. Then the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot, he got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
In 2011, Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon. These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism, they were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Haiba. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, there were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see there's this trail that goes inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him, because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation, which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arihano says, sure, I'll be your guide. Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, you two go, I'll meet you over at the boat. So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arihano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach, waiting for Stefan to return. But after quite a while, and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water. And from around the corner, Arihano comes around on his boat, and he's waving to her, and he's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt, and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heike runs into the water, jumps into Arihano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arihano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arihano, where is he? What happened to him? And Arihano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arihano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there, because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arihano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck off of her, but she couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arihano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arihano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arihano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arihano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns. She's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life. And because it was a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water. And when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arihano must have turned around because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan, and initially they couldn't find him and they couldn't find Arihano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century, and they were known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiva, which is where Stefan had just gone missing, and where Heike had just been attacked by Arihano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arihano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arihano had gone on their hunt, Arihano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arihano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arihano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arihano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan, Arihano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arihano had ritualistically cannibalized Stefan. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles, but it's also very dangerous and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just got to have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go. And they go pretty far out, but if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trap diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water, and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen. He'll probably get hypercapnia. He won't be able to get to the surface and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those three divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface. And he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other two had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light. There's two dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through, and push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital, they would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their bodies. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those. But over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia, because it was thousands of miles away from civilization. And the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread. And just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges.